Hello everyone and welcome to today's WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar. I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. To interact in today's webinar, please type your questions into the questions window on your control panel. Questions will be answered at the end of today's webinar. Presenter and moderator cameras will be used only for the start of this presentation and then again at the end when we address questions. Today's webinar is also being recorded and is part of a National Safe Work Australia Month as well. I would now like to present today's presenter, Lynn McGaurr from COTA Tasmania. Dr. Lynn has worked as COTA Tasmania's Elder Abuse Prevention Officer since 2017. In this role, she has delivered talks about elder abuse to practicing and trainee nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, social workers, aged care staff, TAFE students, and many others. Together with her CEO, Lynn represents COTA Tasmania on statewide Elder Abuse Prevention Advisory Committee. In 2022, she helped organise the 7th National Elder Abuse Conference, which was held in Hobart for the first time and moderated on a panel moderated on Tasmania's elder abuse services. Lynn has a PhD in media and in 2018 gave a presentation on developing journalism protocols for reporting elder abuse at the Australian Association of Gynecology Conference in Melbourne. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you. I'm just going to say hello to everybody and then I'll probably turn my camera off just to do my best to make sure we don't have any problems with our connections. So thank you so much for coming along today, everybody. I really appreciate it. I hope that you learned something from my presentation. I know we've got a very diverse audience, so I won't aim everything at people who are delivering services directly to older people. But towards the end of my presentation, when I start to talk about developing an elder abuse policy, some of the information that I give will be more applicable to organisations whose workers do deliver direct care services. But I still think that a general audience of managers and workers will find information in there that will be relevant if they want to develop their own, perhaps briefer sort of elder abuse policy tailored to their own workplace. Okay, so I'll just turn the camera off there. So I'm going to start with an acknowledgement to country in a moment, then I'll introduce COTA briefly, say a little bit about Tasmania's response to elder abuse, and then I'm going to give an example of a case of elder abuse that is very well documented and well known in Tasmania, because I think by hearing a story of elder abuse of this kind, it helps to frame the rest of my discussion today. Then I'll talk about prevalence, types of elder abuse, possible indicators, so that, you know, if you're somebody who's coming in contact with an older person as part of your work, you might notice some of these indicators, co-occurrences or signs, and it might just, you know, cause you to be a little bit concerned. And if that's the case, then there are referral options out there and places that you can go to learn a little bit about whether or not this might be a case of elder abuse, and you can find out a bit more about what you can do. And also, if the person that you're concerned about actually discloses their abuse to you, you might be able to give them information about these referral options, if that's something that your workplace is comfortable with you doing. Otherwise, we would advise you to speak to your manager first before you go ahead and do something like that. So then I'll talk a little bit about developing a workplace elder abuse policy, as I said, with emphasis on the situation for direct care service providers. I'll talk about what direct care staff can do, and then I'll talk about what we can all do. So I'll conclude with a little bit of information about ageism, because that's a primary driver of elder abuse. So in acknowledging country, I'd like to say that in recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, I acknowledge the Muwawina people, the traditional owners of the land where I'm sitting today. I acknowledge and pay my respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal communities, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity and culture. I want to express my deep admiration for their continuing connection to land, sea, waterways, sky and culture, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are watching today. Thank you for coming along. Okay, COTA Tasmania. COTA stands for the Council on the Ageing. We're a non-government organisation that's been the voice of older Tasmanians for more than 50 years. So our mission is to advance the rights, interests and futures of Australians as we age. Most of what we do to achieve that is done through advocacy at a systemic level, but we do receive some funding from various sources, including the Commonwealth and the state government, for some of our activities. And our elder abuse primary prevention and awareness raising activities are funded by the Tasmanian government. So our vision is that ageing in Tasmania is a time of possibility, opportunity and influence. And I'd really like you to think about that a little bit, because I think, you know, it's probably a little bit different from the way that ageing is portrayed in the media often, but also possibly a little bit different to the way that ageing is discussed in some of the social situations you might find yourself in. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm just trying to get the slide to move on. Hoping that that will happen. Maybe Steph will move it on for me. Thank you. Sorry about that. So most of us will get old. It's in our interest to create a society where older people are respected and their rights are protected. But for some reason, when we're young and fit, we find it incredibly difficult to imagine ourselves in later life. So maybe it's not enough to explain that one day most of us will be old ourselves. Perhaps the most important thing is to remind ourselves that everyone deserves respect and dignity, whatever their age. People aged 65 and older make a huge contribution to our society and communities in a multitude of ways, in many cases working in paid employment or as volunteers, and people are increasingly living independently, well past retirement age, many funding their own retirement. So, you know, at COTA Tasmania, we would never refer to Australia and Tasmania's ageing population as something like a grey tsunami. You know, we see the fact that people are living longer lives, but healthier lives in older age, in that longer period of older age, as a real achievement, something to be celebrated. But as you can see from this slide, Tasmania's population is definitely ageing. So this shows the statistics, the percentage of the population that's age 65 or older from the census of 1996 right through to the census of 2021. And you can see that about 21% of the Tasmanian population is now age 65 or older, and that's more than 100,000 Tasmanians. So there are a lot of people out there in this age bracket, and that means that, you know, Tasmania's response to elder abuse needs to be really something that we can be proud of, and possibly something we can lead the way in, I think, across the country. I'll just go to the next slide. Tasmania's had a response to elder abuse since 2011. That's when the first elder abuse strategy was released. But COTA and other community organisations had to lobby hard for that to happen for about 10 years before 2010, when all three major parties in Tasmania came out in support of an elder abuse policy. That was a great turning point, I think, which is not to say there isn't still a lot to do. The fact that we're still needing to try to raise awareness of elder abuse today, just as hard as we had to back then, I think is an indication of that. I'll go to the next slide now. So I guess we really need to know today what we're talking about when we talk about elder abuse. So it's defined in Tasmania's strategy and in the National Plan on Elder Abuse in the same terms that the World Health Organization adopts, which is as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there's an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person. So it's not probably absolutely clear in that definition that what our elder abuse strategies address is elder abuse in the community. So when we say there's a relationship where there's an expectation of trust, I can understand why some people might think that that could apply in professional relationships and relationships between workers and their clients or customers. But in my talk today, and in the elder abuse strategy that Tasmania has at the moment, and in the national plan, what we're talking about is elder abuse that's perpetrated by friends and relatives and other people in the community that the person concerned trusts in those sorts of contexts. So next slide. There are, in Tasmania's elder abuse strategy, a number of different forms of elder abuse identified. They're listed here, and I won't talk about them in too much detail now, because what I really want to do first is go on and give you this example that I mentioned earlier, the example of Janet McCosdy. So I'll have the next slide, if that's okay, Steph. One reason I tell Mrs. McCosdy's story is that it's on the public record. She died from hypothermia in 2010, aged 77. Her daughter and son-in-law went to trial for manslaughter in 2015, and a coronial inquest into the circumstances leading up to her death was handed down in 2018. So the case is extensively documented. But another reason I use this example is that it demonstrates that different forms of elder abuse are often present at the same time. And elder abuse is often hidden. So sadly, if Janet McCosdy hadn't died in the way that she did, there would have been no coronial inquest, and we might never have understood that there was much more to the elder abuse that she endured than culpable neglect. So Janet McCosdy was extremely careful with her money. As she aged, she lived on her pension and the interest from assets that she managed very well with the assistance of a financial advisor. So Mrs. McCosdy's ability to manage her health and finances only waned as she began to develop dementia. And this was sometime after 2002. It could have been a number of years after that, I'm not quite sure exactly when, because as you probably know, dementia is progressive and it's difficult often to pinpoint exactly when it begins. In 2007, Mrs. McCosdy followed her daughter, son-in-law and grandchildren to Tasmania. Although her dementia had progressed, the coroner found later that it was likely she still understood what she was doing when she bought a unit in New Norfolk to be near her daughter and grandchildren. So the coroner determined that she had the decision-making capacity at that stage to enter into those legal agreements that are associated with buying a property. She lived in this unit until 2009 when she had a bad fall and was discharged from respite following a period in hospital, discharged from respite into the care of her daughter. Also in 2009, the title of Mrs. McCosdy's own unit in New Norfolk was transferred to her daughter, and this was done in a way that wasn't really acceptable as far as the coroner was concerned. A friend of the daughter arranged for Mrs. McCosdy to do this at a barbecue at the daughter's house, I think. I think the barbecue was at the daughter's house. And at a time that the coroner has concluded that Mrs. McCosdy no longer had the decision-making capacity to know what she was really doing at that stage. While living with her daughter, Mrs. McCosdy needed 24-hour care, but her daughter would not accept assistance. This meant that by this time, there was very little opportunity for anyone outside the family to see what was happening to Mrs. McCosdy. When the daughter and her family moved out of New Norfolk to a dwelling on a large block of land, they took Mrs. McCosdy with them, but this property was barely habitable and certainly entirely inadequate for the needs of Mrs. McCosdy. There was a shipping container near the living accommodation which was not lined, had gaps in the walls where windows had been installed, and was heated only by a 3-bar electric heater. And not only that, but the cord connecting the heater to the electricity supply went out the door of the shipping container and into the accommodation beyond, so the door of the shipping container couldn't close properly. So in other words, in winter, the shipping container was freezing, literally. This is where Mrs. McCosdy was put to bed on a July night in 2010 and where she died of hypothermia. But her body was not discovered by her daughter and son-in-law until after they'd been to town the next morning and been to town and back the next morning, which is an indication, among many others, of how little they cared about her or for her, or at least how little they cared, I think we can say. Mrs. McCosdy's daughter and son-in-law were tried in 2015 and convicted of manslaughter by culpable negligence. They were sentenced to 2 years in prison, but their sentences were wholly suspended. So we could go on to the next slide now, Steph, which is just another newspaper headline. Only during the coroner's inquest in 2018 did it become apparent that, as well as neglecting Mrs. McCosdy, her daughter and son-in-law had isolated her and exploited her financially. In her report, Coroner McTaggart wrote that while Mrs. McCosdy was in the care of her daughter and son-in-law, they spent almost 3/4 of the value of her estate, and they largely spent that on things that weren't in the interests of Mrs. McCosdy. The coroner concluded that when the daughter and her husband had refused services for Mrs. McCosdy, they'd done so to avoid scrutiny of their actions. She further concluded, in my view, the neglect of Mrs. McCosdy's health and her financial exploitation over an extended period by family members whom she trusted falls within the definition of elder abuse. So that's one of the really worst cases of elder abuse that I've come across in my readings about elder abuse. And certainly that coroner's report came down after I started here at COTA Tasmania, and it gained a lot of attention amongst community groups, legal groups, and indeed the state government, and was instrumental in leading to, among other things, in leading to a revision of the state's elder abuse strategy. So I'll go on to the next slide now. Thanks, Steph. Okay, so keeping that example in mind, I'd just like now to take you through what we do know about elder abuse. And so much of what we know about the prevalence of elder abuse, we've only really just discovered because it was only in 2021 that we got the report from the Australian Institute of Family Studies of Australia's first national elder abuse prevalence study. It was released by the Australian government in December 2021. Next slide, thanks, Steph. So I suppose it's important to know that this prevalence study was based on, I think it was released in December 2021. Sorry about that. It's based on a representative sample of 7,000 Australians who did not have cognitive incapacity. So it didn't take into account people with dementia or other forms of cognitive incapacity. All the people who were in the survey were aged 65 or older, and they were living in the community. So it didn't take into account people living in residential aged care. The study found that of those people surveyed, 15% had experienced elder abuse in the previous 12 months. So that's 1 in 6 older Australians. I think I'm sometimes going to be able to do this myself, but other times I'll have to ask Steph to change the slides. So the survey also looked at how many the different forms of elder abuse that people were experiencing, and it found that 12% of those experienced psychological abuse, but also that many people experienced multiple forms of abuse at the same time. Next came neglect, then financial abuse, then physical abuse, and then sexual abuse. Might have to get you to do it, Steph, sorry. Thank you. In terms of who can experience elder abuse, anybody, who falls into that definition of somebody aged 65 or older can experience elder abuse. But the survey found that people of lower socioeconomic status were at higher risk. It found that being single, separated, or divorced put someone at higher risk. Living in rented housing or owning a house with a debt against it also put people at higher risk. That said, there is considerable elder abuse that, as in the case of Mrs. McCosdy, occurs when somebody owns a property and adult sons or daughters or other trusted people seek to gain access to the funds invested in that property. So not surprisingly, factors associated with a lower risk of elder abuse, given what we know about what puts people at risk of elder abuse, are being married or living in a relationship, having good physical or psychological health, owning your own home without debt, or having higher levels of social support. And as we can see, Mrs. McCosdy, the only one of those things that Mrs. McCosdy had towards the end of her life was that she owned her own home without debt. So she didn't have many protective factors around her. Next slide, please. So the survey also found that 1 in 5 perpetrators of elder abuse were adult children. And children are also the biggest perpetrator group for all the subtypes of elder abuse except sexual abuse. But interestingly, men, although more likely to commit elder abuse than women, are not as highly represented in the category of perpetrators as they might be in abuse between spouses. And it's also the case that almost the same number of men and women experience elder abuse. So elder abuse is a bit different from that category of abuse between spouses in that it's less gendered than domestic violence. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk quickly about types of elder abuse, but I'm not going to read every example on each of the slides. I'm just going to go through them fairly quickly so that you can perhaps pick up on some of the examples given, but I think these are often things that you can probably imagine would come under the categories concerned. Next slide, please, Steph. So psychological abuse, it includes degrading and humiliating and treating somebody like a child and verbally abusing them, but it also includes, preventing somebody from speaking or making someone feel worthless or burdensome or like they don't deserve to be cared for. There's many other forms of psychological abuse, but that's just a few. Next slide, please, Steph. Neglect, as well as this kind of neglect that Mrs. McCosty faced, where somebody's physical and emotional needs and other needs are simply not met. Neglect can result when somebody actually, there's a combination here of financial abuse and neglect in some of these examples, because if someone's receiving a carer's allowance and not providing care to the older person, then they're exploiting them financially as well as neglecting them. The same goes for people who gain access to someone's Centrelink benefit and then don't provide them with the care that they're required to give. Physical abuse includes pushing, shoving and other rough handling, hitting, punching, twisting limbs. Also though, using chemical restraints and things that you might not think of sometimes, such as using alcohol to restrain somebody, or giving them prescription medications in a way that they're not meant to be provided, or giving someone unprescribed medications. Also, pushing someone very hard or twisting their limbs or not taking care that they're not hurt when they're being moved, those kinds of things, disregarding somebody's physical well-being in a way that causes them physical injury is also physical abuse in many cases. Next slide, please, Steph. Sexual abuse, as well as the behaviours that you, I imagine, would already associate with sexual abuse. Viewing pornographic videos or making obscene phone calls in the presence of an older person without their consent is considered a form of sexual abuse. And social abuse, this is, the form of abuse that was so evident in Mrs. McCosty's case, forcing isolation on someone, preventing their contact with people in the outside world. Sometimes it might be family and friends, but sometimes it might be services, stopping people being able to go to community groups or, neighbourhood houses, all sorts of ways of preventing them from having contact, withholding mail, stopping them talking to other people on the phone, and actually monitoring somebody's phone is a form of abuse if you're doing that without their consent, of course, too. And in Tasmania's elder abuse strategy, there's also more recently a category of spiritual abuse, which refers to denying a person their right to practice their religion. So it sort of overlaps with social abuse, I think, but also using religion or spiritual practices to frighten, intimidate or isolate a person. So what we find, though, is that often people who are just sort of slipping into that phase of perhaps becoming abusive can find all kinds of ways to rationalise their behaviour to themselves. And that might include thinking that, well, one day this person, in the case of financial abuse, well, one day this person's going to leave me money in their will. This person's needs are not as great as they used to be, but my needs are very great. And it's perfectly reasonable that I should start using those funds now rather than waiting now when I think I need them, rather than waiting until my parent dies to have access to them. And in those circumstances, sometimes people can pressure someone into giving them power of attorney, but even without enduring power of attorney, sometimes people can gain access to bank accounts, or they can, as was the case with Mrs. McCosty, they can forge people's, it's likely, the coroner says, that sometimes Mrs. McCosty's signatures were forged, or sometimes she was encouraged to sign cheques that she didn't understand. There are all kinds of ways that this can happen. So if you're in a, there are all kinds of jobs, you know, where you might come in contact with older people over a period of time. And I think in terms of possible indicators and co-occurrences, it's that situation where something changes and you notice that, you know, somebody who once was a cheerful, happy person has become really quite reclusive. You're not seeing them anymore, or not seeing them as much, or they're not making eye contact with you. This is the reason that we like to give these kinds of talks to people who are actually working in occupations, and not only give these talks to the general community, because we think that, you know, in many occupations people have a particular insight into their customers or clients, and sometimes, you know, have a professional relationship with them over a number of years, and so we like workers to understand that there really are some occasions when it might be a good idea to, as Tasmania's Elder Abuse Awareness Campaign says, to ask the question, could this be elder abuse? Now, I'm not saying to go up and ask the person concerned if it's elder abuse, but to ask yourself, might this be elder abuse? So when I talk about these possible indicators, co-occurrences and signs in the next couple of slides, I'm thinking here about a situation where somebody hasn't come to you and told you that something's happening. I'm talking here about a situation where you might become concerned over a period of time. So depending on what kind of job you have and what kind of ways you come in contact with older people, you might notice that when you go into their home, if that's part of your job, that there are bills lying around unpaid. If you work in a bank, you might notice unusual activity in their accounts or on their credit card statements. I mean, that sort of thing applies if it's another family member who you know, who's not the person being abusive. They might discover these things on some occasion too. It's not just workers, of course. If you do visit the person's home, you might notice that some of their possessions go missing. One of the ads in the current elder abuse campaign focuses in on somebody's engagement ring going missing, and people noticing that the engagement ring that she used to wear is no longer there, and maybe, you know, commenting on that. An empty fridge where previously it was well stocked, avoidance or absence from social activities, and as we know, unexplained injuries. Though of course, where injuries are concerned, as healthcare workers would know, sometimes there are explanations for injuries that might look really dreadful, but on some occasions there aren't reasonable explanations for those, and certainly it's an unexplained injury is something that we should think about carefully if we see something like that. So possible co-occurrences, these are the kinds of things that don't necessarily mean that there's elder abuse happening, but if you're already a little bit concerned, possibly because of some of those indicators I've mentioned earlier, if these things are happening at the same time, it might raise your level of concern a bit. So adult children suddenly returning home to the parental home, possibly as a result of divorce or something like that, because sometimes what happens is an adult child will move back into the parental home, not intending to stay there for a long period of time, but things change and that adult child never leaves, and the longer they stay, the more unpleasant their behaviour towards the older person becomes, until it can become quite intolerable and into the sphere of elder abuse. A history of family dysfunction, maybe, an adult child's substance abuse, gambling or financial stress, or if there's a carer who you feel a little bit concerned about, if that carer is feeling unsupported or struggling to care for the older person, you know, and you have other reasons to be concerned, maybe that carer needs a bit of support, and or maybe it's more than that, but certainly it's a reason to have to be concerned if other factors are evident as well. In terms of your interactions with the older person themselves, a brochure from the Aged and Community Services Association includes the following signs that you may notice: fearful or hesitant behaviour, showing ambivalence around a particular person or people. So that ambivalence could be an indication that the older person is you know, fearful or troubled by what that other person or people are doing. Being worried or anxious for no real reason or no apparent reason, or fearful, sorry, not no real reason, for no obvious reason that you know of being fearful at being touched, being irritable or overly emotional when that's not their normal presentation, or using contradictory statements. And that's a really interesting one because, you know, presuming that the person doesn't have any mental confusion, sometimes a person will say, you know, they'll make some kind of statement about being worried or concerned, and then they'll think about the possible consequences of that, and they'll say, oh no, everything's fine, you know. So that, I think that's what's being suggested there. Reluctant to talk openly, displaying signs of shame, or avoiding physical eye or verbal contact. So before I go on to talk about what help is available, I probably should mention that one of the issues we have at the moment is that despite 10 years of trying to raise awareness of elder abuse, the National Prevalence Study found that still only a third of those people who say they've experienced elder abuse are actually seeking assistance from a third party. And, you know, this is really worrying, and another reason why we are doing as much as we can to alert the entire community to elder abuse and encourage people to think about it a little bit more than they might have otherwise. We know some of the reasons why people might not seek help, because they're terribly ashamed, and you know, it's in cases where somebody does disclose some abusive behaviour but then says that they don't want any intervention, that sense of shame can be at the heart of that. But it's also a reason why people don't talk about it to third parties at all. Concern for an adult child. So even though a person is being abused, they might still be concerned that the child, they still love the child and they don't want anything bad to happen to the child. They just want the family to be healed. They fear retribution from the person who's being abusive if they tell anybody about it. They fear neglect or further neglect if the person is removed from the situation, or they're concerned about how long it might take to get an outcome if they're an older person who doesn't know how much time they have left. So it's important to know that if you're concerned about an older person, it is possible for anybody in the community to ring the Elder Abuse Helpline. It's a helpline, it's not a hotline, it's not a place you go to report elder abuse and then expect the police to come along and do something about it, unless it's a life-threatening emergency when you would ring 000. The Elder Abuse Helpline is a place to go to get information about whether or not what you're seeing or hearing or concerned about qualifies as elder abuse, and if it does, what you might do in those circumstances. And that's going to be different according to whether the person has disclosed the abuse to you, whether or not they've given you permission to speak on their behalf. If you don't have the permission of the person experiencing abuse to take action on their behalf, then you'll have to talk to the Elder Abuse Helpline in general terms. But you can talk about that dilemma to the helpline. If the person has given you permission, then the best thing to do in those circumstances is to help the person to ring their helpline with you, so that the people on the helpline know that you have their permission, and together you can discuss what the options are, and the helpline will talk about those options. The older person can also, in some circumstances, tell the Elder Abuse Helpline that they're happy for the helpline to talk directly to you, and the older person can then step back if that's what they want to do. But it is important, if you're going to talk about a specific situation of somebody who has cognitive capacity still, who doesn't have dementia, it's important to get their consent. Legal Aid Senior Assist Service is a great service. It offers not just free, confidential legal information and advice, but it also has a case management service, which is fantastic, because sometimes, you know, whatever's happening on the legal side, you still need action to keep the person safe and to make their life bearable in other areas, through social work activities, possibly through sorting out the housing situation, all sorts of things. So it's wonderful to have that case management service working together with Legal Aid Senior Assist Legal Service. Relationships Australia Tasmania has another great service which can offer family mediation, and it can also offer counselling to older people who are experiencing or concerned about elder abuse. And it can do that to try to empower the older person to express what they really want to happen, because sometimes those conversations are within families can be very, very difficult, particularly if an older person has been in a situation where they've been disempowered over a long period of time by one member of the family. Advocacy Tasmania, as well as operating the Elder Abuse Helpline, can advocate on an older person's behalf. At COTA, we have free monthly, all of these services, I should say, are free to people aged 65 or older experiencing elder abuse or concerned about elder abuse. Free monthly elder law clinics at COTA Tasmania, where people can talk about any legal matter. But there are also community legal services, community social workers, and in certain circumstances where issues of cognitive capacity are concerned, there is also the civil and administrative tribunals guardianship stream. But as I say, in an emergency, it's really important to ring the Tasmanian Police. So quickly now, I'm going to talk about developing an elder abuse policy for your staff. So the Tasmanian government in 2011 started encouraging workplaces to develop an elder abuse policy so that their staff and workers and managers would know what to do if staff encountered situations where they were concerned about elder abuse possibly occurring. So these policies should increase awareness of elder abuse, that it happens in the community so staff know that it occurs, improve the ability of health and community workers to detect and act on signs and symptoms of abuse when first detected, educate staff in effective intervention, provide clear role expectations of staff and managers to address abuse, and provide pathways for addressing abuse with the goal of abuse ceasing. So this is particularly important where there are direct care workers involved. A version of these kinds of policies may be appropriate in other kinds of workplaces. I'm not going to go into duty of care and assessing capacity, but I would say that in any elder abuse policy in the workplace of a direct care provider, that staff should most definitely be given information and training in duty of care, and they should be given information about what to do if they're concerned that someone may lack cognitive capacity. So the elder abuse, I'm going to focus here on the expectations of workers, which should be to follow their agency's policies and procedures. Now, this should all be in the elder abuse policy. Contact Tasmania Police or an ambulance if the matter is urgent. Refer suspected, disclosed, witnessed or alleged abuse to their supervisor. Discuss possible options with an older person. Keep a detailed, confidential record of what happened. The worker is not expected to solve the problem, medically assess an older person and their living situation in any way, decide whether the incident meets the threshold of laying criminal charges. You know, I mean, if the direct care, if there's an ACAT assessor there to make assessments of the older person's situation, then of course they are there to make those assessments. But generally speaking, the main thing is that the worker should not be expected to make assessments or take actions or give any advice that's beyond their the scope of their actual employment and work. So there are also expectations of supervisors, but basically, you know, they need to refer the abuse of the older person to the appropriate authority, agency or service, and ensure the safety and well-being of the older person. Where possible, the supervisor should seek the consent of the older person to a referral. So they can discuss the possible options with the older person, and they can organise support if required, but it's important to keep a detailed and secure record of what happened in accordance with whatever the organisation's record keeping policies and procedures are, and to inform their managers if they're concerned. They should also always provide opportunities for feedback to their workers, supporting them and making it very clear that workers can come to them with any concerns that they have about home visits or general support. Supervisors also need, and organisations also need to be cognizant of, you know, the diversity in their clients and customers. So they should liaise with in circumstances where the person is Aboriginal called or LGBTIQ+, or has other mental conditions, perhaps not dementia, but perhaps other mental conditions. They should liaise with trusted community organisations who are involved in those particular groups of people to increase their knowledge of what considerations they need to keep in mind. Distribute copies of the Elder Abuse Bookmark available in 20 languages, which I'll show you in a minute. If language is a barrier, use the services of an independent translator instead of relying wholly on a family member who may possibly not translate accurately, particularly if that person's a perpetrator. And recognise and involve community members where possible. So if you go to www.humanrights.gov.au/elderabuse, you'll find these resources available in 20 different languages, which you can use to let people know about the services that are available through the Elder Abuse Helpline. And, you know, even in cases where people haven't, you may not be concerned about elder abuse or you haven't nobody's disclosed elder abuse to you, it's still perfectly reasonable to distribute the elder abuse bookmarks widely, because that's similar to, you know, advertising the elder abuse helpline the way that the government does on television. You know, it's important for everyone to know that there's that elder abuse occurs and that there are resources available. So quickly, what direct care workers can do: consider all those issues of consent, privacy, capacity, duty of care, and balancing autonomy and safeguarding, or the need for an interpreter or cultural advisor. Obviously, this is going to be detailed. These things are going to be detailed in the organisation's elder abuse policy and other training that it provides. Call the police if a person's life is in danger or you believe a crime is being committed. If the client discloses elder abuse, listen and reassure them. If the client does not disclose but you're concerned, ask open-ended, non-judgmental questions that may result in them feeling confident enough or comfortable enough with you to speak about what might be happening. In both cases, note any risks or indicators. If the older person has decision-making capacity, discuss the situation and options with the client if they've disclosed, document them and request consent to provide further assistance. If the older person doesn't want any intervention, assure them of your continued support and assistance if they require it or request it, provide information and arrange follow-up and monitoring of the situation if possible. If not possible, document and withdraw, but tell your supervisor about the situation. If the older person lacks capacity, definitely discuss your concerns with your supervisor. Check if there's a substitute. Now, you may do this in consultation with your supervisor, or it might be your supervisor who actually takes the next steps, which is to check if there's a substitute decision maker and if that person consents to intervention. If the substitute decision maker, so that's the person who's been appointed as the enduring power of attorney or the enduring guardian, is the alleged abuser, then, you know, the organisation is going to have to consider possibly taking this up with the Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. What we can all do, though, is if someone confides in you that they're being mistreated, listen and reassure them that they're not alone. Tell them about the elder abuse helpline, and if appropriate, you can offer to help them make the call. If you're concerned that the person has not disclosed anything to you, discuss this with your supervisor and/or ring the elder abuse helpline yourself to talk about the issues you've encountered in general terms and find out more about what you might be able to do. Tell lots of people about the elder abuse helpline. It's there for anyone and everyone to use. It's really important that people know that it's there and that anyone can ring, that whatever they talk about will be confidential, and it's a free service, and it's the support provided is sensitive, and it's the first point of call in most instances. The other thing is you can raise awareness of elder abuse yourself. You could do this by joining the annual Walks Against Elder Abuse, which are held on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day every year, which is the 15th of June, because I think the day was decreed in the Northern Hemisphere where that was the middle of summer, and unfortunately here it's the middle of winter, so we're very dedicated people who go out and march on the 15th of June. But also try to stop ageism. This is my final point, and I thank you all so much for listening to this very long talk. But, you know, measures designed to identify perpetrators and support victims are only part of the solution. Just as in the case of violence against younger women, structural factors are at the heart of much elder abuse. Tasmania's Active Ageing Plan promotes actions to address ageism and combat age-related stereotypes. So ageism is embedded in our workplaces, social practices and culture. A research report by the Australian Human Rights Commission published in 2013 found that ageing holds predominantly negative connotations, particularly among younger Australians, quite the opposite to what our vision says. The report points out that younger Australians find it extremely difficult to identify any benefits associated with ageing and indicate it is simply not something that they have given much thought to at this point in their lives. And yet a lot of older people identify many benefits to ageing. The Human Rights Commission found that older and younger Australians viewed ageing very differently, and this led to tensions between them, with misconceptions about ageing leading to many negative stereotypes. So what we think at COTA Tasmania is, and I'm trying to go on to the next slide. Whoops, went back too far. Sorry about this. That people should challenge others who speak of our ageing population as a burden on society or a grace and army rather than an achievement. Challenge those who speak to older people as if they were children. Avoid ageist jokes. And above all, adopt Tasmania's vision as your own, that ageing in Tasmania is a time of possibility, opportunity and influence. So thank you very much, everybody. I can give you, if you want to go into what's involved in developing a sort of bespoke elder abuse policy for your organisation, please don't hesitate to contact me at lynm@cotatas.org.au. But you can also find a lot more information about elder abuse at those URLs that are up there on the screen now. And thanks so much, Stephanie, for all your help.
No, thank you very much, Lynn, for your presentation today. And we do have time for questions. So if anyone does have any questions for Dr. Lynn McGaurr from COTA Tasmania, please use the control panel to type and submit those questions. Lynn, is it only age 65 and above for the use of the referral information points?
Yes, this is an interesting point. At COTA Tasmania and in a lot of the organisations, you know, we don't sort of go out there and tell people when they're defined as older, but there are, in terms of funding, some requirements. And so in most cases, for those services to be provided free to an older person, that person will need to be 65 or older. But if a person's in a really dreadful situation, there's going to be, you know, there'll be ways that help, some sort of help can be provided. So it's still worth contacting the Elder Abuse Helpline, I believe, just to find out what other options there might be.
All right,
but
thanks, Lynn.
we think that you know, people have their own views about, in the more general sense, about when they might be considered an older person or not, and we let people self-define in most circumstances.
Thanks. Elder abuse and elder suicide, is there a connection?
I don't know if there's been any research done on that. Interestingly, though, I know. Yes, I was going to talk about some of the media coverage of elder at one time when elder abuse and voluntary assisted dying were being discussed at the same time. But I don't think this probably isn't the place to talk about that. But I have no knowledge of any research about elder abuse and suicide. I'm sorry.
All right, thanks. Is COTA Tasmania available to assist organisations to develop elder abuse policies?
We've got access to a really great document that was produced. It's quite extensive, that was produced quite some time ago, and I understand is currently being revised by the state government. So we could certainly, I'd be very happy to have meetings with people in organisations if they'd like to discuss further, and we can look at that document and talk about their particular situation and what might be relevant to their organisation's workforce. We've done that in the past, and then the organisation has gone on to develop their own plan, but we've had those conversations to help get that process underway. So,
right,
yes, happy to help as much as we can.
All right, thanks, Lynn. Today's webinar is part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month, so please do head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to find out what else we have running over the next few weeks during October, both online and in person. We do still have time for you to type your questions into the control panel for our presenter today, Dr. Lynn McGaurr from COTA Tasmania.
And if anybody wants to contact me directly with questions, that's fine too. Sometimes these things occur to you later on, so please feel free to do that.
Thanks, Lynn. There's no further questions coming through, Lynn. I'll begin to wrap up today's webinar. So thank you again to today's presenter, Dr. Lynn McGaurr from COTA Tasmania, for her presentation, run as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month 2022. Please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to find out what else we have running throughout the month of October. WorkSafe Tasmania Month is an initiative of the Work Cover Tasmania Board delivered by WorkSafe Tasmania, and it is also run in conjunction with National Safe Work Month. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Lynn.
Thanks very much, Stephanie.